East London is plagued by mysterious murders committed by the press label courtesan killer, and little kids are disappearing from the Sacred Art orphanage. The Metropolitan Police are wandering in the dark, and it's up to 3 unlikely heroes to uncover the truth in this grim steampunk Victorian age. Will they rise to become heroes, or will they be crushed by the city and their personal demons? Sovereign Syndicate is a narrative-driven RPG developed and published by Crimson Herring Studios. It hit stores in January 2024, and they recently gifted me a key to try it. The game had already crossed my radar a while back, but it ended up taking a backseat because, admittedly, steampunk is not my favorite science fiction subgenre, and I wasn't thrilled by the minotaur in the tall hat. But I was wrong. If you're a gamer who enjoys story-rich and immersive games, this one might be for you. To give you an idea of my approach, I go all in when playing a game. I unlock all achievements and strive to explore every aspect through completionism and multiple playthroughs. That being said, I understand that these experiences are subjective, and what is enough for me might be too much or too little for someone else. I did different runs of the game with opposite character builds, high and low temperament, that's the character's morale, more on that later, and essentially save-scummed a lot to see what kind of consequences different choices have. This game revolves around its narrative and setting. It spans 18 chapters, none of them too long, alternating between the perspectives of the 3 different characters. You will explore the same areas with each of them, discovering new interactions, clues, and following their personal stories. Sovereign Syndicate will throw walls of text at you, not only through description and dialogues, but also through the different voices in the characters' heads. Different aspects of their personalities will evolve based on your choices, commenting on your findings and suggesting courses of actions. A full run may take about 15 hours if you do all the secondary quests, here called tasks, but way less if you stick only to the main story. The game is relatively cheap, costing around €20 of dollars, but it's also often discounted and sold in bundles with similar games. A word of caution: the user-defined tags on the Steam store page advertise Sovereign Syndicate incorrectly. This game is not a CRPG, at least not in my view. If you're looking for the usual CRPG features like character creation and turn-based or real-time with pause combat, this game is going to disappoint you. And it won't be Crimson Herring's fault. They didn't assign those tags to that page, the community did. I'm mentioning this because I've seen a lot of misunderstanding about it on the internet. Without further ado, let's dive in. Considering this is the first game from Crimson Herring Studios, it's quite well polished. I haven't experienced a single crash, and the loading times for the areas are pretty quick. I haven't encountered any bugs worth mentioning. Pathfinding for the characters is decent, it works surprisingly well in some areas, although you might get momentarily stuck on the bordello stairs. I guess you do want to leave. It seems to be an issue with those specific stair models, as I haven't experienced it elsewhere. The camera follows you and can't be rotated, but it generally does a good job, except in very tight areas. Sometimes in those places it may zoom in and out or rotate in a weird way, but it wasn't a major issue for me, nothing deal-breaking. I did experience some vertical screen tearing, and there wasn't a VSync option in the game menus. I had to force it for the application through the graphics card control panel, which significantly reduced that problem. I should also note that the game's performance dipped noticeably in one specific exterior area with foliage and rain, but you only need to be there briefly, so it's not a big deal. This is usually the moment for character creation, but in this game there isn't any, because you play as 3 pre-generated characters. Now, a word of caution. Since this is essentially a narrative game, everything is potentially a spoiler because the story is the main focus, and some people are more sensitive to even minor spoilers. I will keep spoilers to a minimum, but a few minor ones are inevitable if I want to talk about Sovereign Syndicate at all. You've been warned, skip to the conclusion chapter if needed. In Sovereign Syndicate, you alternate between playing 3 characters: Atticus Daly, a minotaur magician with an alcohol problem who lives in squalor; Clara Reed, a well-educated and intelligent courtesan running from her past; and Teddy Redgrave, a dwarf artificer who is also a monster hunter. He has a mechanical friend, Ado, an automaton he built that will serve as sort of 4th playable character in a couple of episodes. Ado can also wear a bow tie, which is red. The first time you play as any of these characters, you'll be presented with an archetype to choose from. This archetype will grant you 3 bonuses to your attributes, a major arcana tarot card, and a trait. Now, don't feel overwhelmed because it's pretty simple once you look into it. Every character has 4 different attributes that function as actual skills, depending on the character. For example, Atticus the Minotaur has Animal Instinct, spryness, wit and self-discipline, reflecting his duality between possibly being a violent beast or an intelligent magician trying to restrain himself. Clara has intuition, grace, intellect and tact, as she's a smart and charismatic person. Teddy, being an engineer and a veteran, has impulse, ingenuity, analysis and empathy. Choosing an archetype essentially lets you choose the two main attributes the character will rely on, and how you will most likely play them. These attributes will grow with use. In Sovereign Syndicate, there are no character levels or points to distribute. In dialogue, you'll often be prompted to choose a line based on your attributes. When you do, you'll gain points, called humors, specific to the attribute you're using. Gain a certain number of these points, and your attributes will level up, making skill checks easier. Skill checks are performed by drawing a card from a tarot deck, adding the card's number to your relevant attribute value, and comparing the result against a difficulty class. It's not really different from rolling dice, but it's a bit more aesthetically pleasing. These cards range from a value of 1 to 14, with 100 and -100 cards that lead to automatic success or failure, so there's a slight chance to always pass or fail a check, no matter how high or low your attribute is. This system encourages you to rely on your top 2 attributes, accumulating the best scores in them by the time you reach the last chapters of the game. It also encourages replayability by letting you do a different run, choosing the opposite 2 attributes from your previous experience, leading to different decisions in the game narrative. Major Arcana cards unlock character traits. You start with one from your archetype and collect new ones through your decisions and actions in the game. Traits unlock new dialogue options, leading to new solutions. Most major Arcana cards have 3 or 4 different interactions during the game, but some may be gained only by a specific character because they are tied to their unique background or role in the story. Each character also has temperament. You can check it at the bottom left of the UI. This value essentially reflects the character's morale, and very high or low morale will unlock additional dialogue options. You have some control over your morale by choosing how Atticus, Clara or Teddy will react to specific interactions in the game world. Characters also have a self-reflection, self-image or superego section in their sheet, showing you additional traits that serve as character tags, further defining them and influencing the game mechanics. Having played the Sovereign Syndicate with all possible character builds, I felt that the more intelligent builds provided a more complete and refined experience than the most violent and physically oriented ones. Sovereign Syndicate is set in a steampunk Victorian era, focusing heavily on what the steampunk subgenre often neglects, the harshness of that real-world period. Imagine this grim world populated by fantastic creatures, a little bit like the worlds of Carnival Row or Penny Dreadful, but with ancient Greek mythological beings. You'll find centaur bobbies, minotaur mobsters, cyclops doctors and inventors. All of this adds a unique touch to the setting. You'll explore a variety of East London areas of different sizes, multiple times and with different characters. The number is clearly limited due to budgetary reasons, but they are well built and immersive. All exterior areas have a different number of interior ones, like shops, a fancy hotel, the sewers, and pressing tab will highlight all the possible interactions in that zone. You will talk to people as well as dive into toilets for money, and every character may have a slightly different or completely new interaction with those people or objects. If you already talked to a street beggar with Atticus, for example, doing the same with Clara or Teddy may trigger a whole different conversation. Sometimes, when you return to an area you've already explored in a different chapter with the same character, you'll find new interactions that may lead to new secondary quests. So, generally speaking, you are rewarded for exploring. Also, always interact with everything you can. You'll never know what may come up. Some areas even have different ways to be approached, and when you enter one, you'll always be shown the appropriate description, setting the mood for the place. A nice immersive touch is that you can fast travel between exterior areas, and most often the game will drop you at that area's train station if it has one, as if you use it to move. The world in Sovereign Syndicate is generally grim, focusing on low-profile characters like beggars, orphans, and underground mobsters, as well as on the arrogance and world of masks and illusions of the wealthy. I would say that the 3 characters you play belong to different social circles. Atticus is the poor and rough, trying to scrape a living while battling his own addiction. Clara, being a courtesan, makes appearances in the world of the wealthy, but she fully knows she's a disposable toy and pays extreme attention to that. Finally, Teddy is the average guy with a past that sometimes haunts him, but who is also decently adjusted in the ecosystem thanks to his professionalism as a monster hunter. The game does a good job of not telling you everything straight away, but revealing it piece by piece. While there are some notable walls of text to read, it's the world itself and the interaction within it that set the tone. For example, when a character reflects on how the children at the orphanage are used as cheap manual labor in factories, and they are told the lie that by being a good worker they will escape that miserable orphan life. Or when, this is my favorite, you can straight up offer cigarettes to the kids in the Sacred Heart courtyard. Nothing wrong with that, right? The game has no combat. Conflicts are resolved through dialogue and comics, and I have to say that, with a couple of notable exceptions in the main story, you have to actively seek out situations in which you choose to use violence, and often it doesn't end well for you. You can die from making the wrong decisions. Other times, the game will miraculously save you, but that's a discussion about choices and consequences that pertains to the story section. Characters have an inventory, and my general advice is to grab and buy everything you can. Some objects will give you bonus points in leveling an attribute or will modify your temperament, giving you more control over those two aspects. What really appealed to my hoarder instinct is that sometimes an interaction will be facilitated or take a different direction just because you have a completely optional object with you. Like I need a reason to have messy inventories full of consumables I never end up using. I don't want to delve too deeply into the story, as it's the foundation of the entire game, and I don't want to spoil it. So, I'll give you a brief introduction and leave the rest for you to discover. Still, minor spoilers ahead. As I mentioned, you'll switch between three characters with different perspectives on life and slightly different social circles. They each have distinct objectives: surviving, making a living in London, or fleeing town entirely. As they pursue these goals, they'll encounter missing children from the Sacred Heart orphanage and murders committed by a figure the newspapers have dubbed the courtesan killer. Naturally, each character becomes entangled in these two cases in different ways, pursuing their work or investigations until everything converges in the endgame. The game spans 18 chapters. The first few are the longest, while the last 6 are relatively quick, tying everything together. Each chapter begins with a summary of the current situation for that specific character, which is helpful since you're constantly switching between them, and ends with an Oscar Wilde quote. A nice touch. My only complaint is that Teddy has fewer chapters because, at some point, you'll control Odo, his automaton. Teddy was kind of my favorite. The story is quite intriguing, starting out like a Jack the Ripper case, but quickly developing its own unique twists. In an interview with Isaac Atway, which I'll link in the video description, he mentioned that he initially started writing a novel, but eventually realized the story was better suited for a game. So, he created a company, hired a team, and developed it, despite facing significant challenges and obstacles. I think some of the game's great narrative moments and dialogues clearly stem from this background. Closely tied to the story is the game's journal, which lists all major and secondary quests, as expected. It's generally clear about what you need to do, with a few notable exceptions. The game warns you when you're nearing the end of each chapter, prompting you to tie up any loose ends before proceeding. However, the challenge is that most of the secondary quests span multiple chapters, so you're often left unsure if you've done everything you can or if you're leaving something unfinished. I recommend making frequent hard saves before advancing to the next chapter and at the start of each new one. Autosaves and quick saves will be overwritten. Regarding consequences, there aren't many automatic negative outcomes for failing a skill check or making a poor decision. Sometimes the game redirects you to the right path, other times you might die, but often one of the voices in your head will warn you when you're about to make a mistake. Pay attention to them. I've experienced what I'd call a good and a bad ending, plus several different smaller variations in the last chapters, depending on the choices you make throughout the game. So there is a bit of branching. Considering this is an indie game and a debut title from Crimson Herring Studios, I'd say it has pretty good graphics. The areas are unique and really contribute to the immersion. There is a zoom function, but it's minimal and you can't rotate the camera. It's not a big deal, it follows you well, with only minor hiccups in tight interiors. This didn't bother me too much. The comic panels for certain events are well drawn and presented gradually, closely following the related narration. The user interface is surprisingly fluid and complete. I say surprisingly not to diminish the studio's work, but because it's one of the first things that struck me about Sovereign Syndicate. It's graphically appealing, consistent with the setting, transitions are smooth, and everything a player might need is easy to access. They did a really good job there. Additionally, all the Victorian slang is explained by hovering your mouse over highlighted words, which is a nice touch. They clearly took some clues from Obsidian and Alcat. The sound design is another aspect of the game that pleasantly surprised me. Each area has its own soundtrack, which is both well composed and performed. They really capture the sounds you'd expect from this type of setting. Depending on the location, you can hear pianos, exotic percussion, and various string instruments, all perfectly fitting for a steampunk Victorian era. There is also a nice event where Clara sings at the speakeasy. Unfortunately, there is no voice acting. The game presents you with a lot of text to read. Sovereign Syndicate contains 420,000 words, while the average novel is between 70,000 and 120,000. This is clearly due to budget constraints. They simply couldn't afford it. However, I know for some people the absence of voice acting can be a deal breaker. It wasn't for me. I'm used to CRPGs without it. I want to share a bit of behind-the-scenes information, since Isaac Atway has been quite open about many aspects of the game development in that interview. First of all, he freely admits that Sovereign Syndicate was heavily influenced by Disco Elysium. I haven't played it yet, everyone speaks very highly of it, but from what I've seen, it didn't feel like the right kind of game for me. However, since I liked Sovereign Syndicate quite a bit, I now think I should keep an open mind and give Disco Elysium a chance too. They initially aimed for a classic RPG style, building everything in 3D but using an orthographic camera to create a 2D isometric perspective. When they were looking for publishers and sending out vertical slices, those companies told them that the game looked outdated, so they decided to keep it fully 3D. Really? In the end, with Crimson Herring being a new studio without any previous work, trying to get financing from risk-averse companies, they ended up not getting a publisher. They eventually discovered and secured funding from the Canadian Media Fund, plus Crimson Herring founder mortgaged his house, which is kinda crazy if you ask me. Lacking a big budget, they had to scrap combat from the game, opting for comic strip events instead. They also couldn't afford localization, so the game was initially published only in English, and for the same reason, it wasn't ported to consoles. Remarkably, they used the first month's revenue and a grant from the Canadian Export Development Department to invest in localization for Russian and Simplified Chinese, two of the biggest language regions outside English, and to fund console porting in an effort to expand their market. The total investment for the game was about 1.5 million Canadian dollars, which is roughly 1.2 million US dollars. That's not much to build a game from scratch, so in my opinion the final quality of Sovereign Syndicate deserves praise. Another interesting anecdote is that Isaac Atway initially tried to get the Shadowrun license due to his love for those early games. The response he received was so humbling that he decided to build his own theme park with blackjack and hookers. I mean, his own IP. Let's wrap this up. Sovereign Syndicate is a nice indie game I can't pronounce correctly for the life of me. It comes pretty cheap and in my opinion you get your money's worth. Temper your expectations by understanding that this is not a CRPG. It's a narrative game with RPG elements. You have fixed characters to play, which you can build as you like. You don't have combat. If it's going to be the weakest part of the game and you have a great story to tell, it's better to cut it out and focus on what you do best. Isaac Atway said that if he has the chance, he wants to include character creation and combat in Sovereign Syndicate too. So, if you think a game with a good story, relatable characters and a good soundtrack might be for you, give it a chance. If you found this video helpful, please like, comment and subscribe. It helps me reach more RPG enthusiasts around the world. Regardless, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. As always, take care of yourself and see you in the next RPG video.